Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. The U.S. president continues his criticism of Canada, today singling out this country's military spending, criticizing how much is spent on domestic defense and how much is invested in multilateral efforts like NATO. Take a listen to what we heard from Donald Trump.
Canada is just about the lowest payer. Also, they shouldn't be. They are just about the lowest payer in NATO, in addition to everything else. So Canada's really been taken advantage of. And if they had to pay just something modestly fair, they wouldn't be able to succeed as a country. And that's why I feel they have to become a state.
Well, to talk about this and other matters, we're now joined by Anita, Anand, Minister for Transport and Internal Trade. Minister, good to see you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Listen, I have to begin with what we just heard from Donald Trump. He says Canada's NATO spending is near the bottom, another reason why this country should become the 51st state. You're a previous defense minister. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I want to stress that Canada is the sixth largest contributor to NATO in absolute terms. And in terms of the NATO defense target of 2%, we are looking at ways to accelerate it. The Prime Minister has announced that we will reach it by 2032. But obviously, it's necessary to continue to accelerate our defense spending, which we have been doing. We have increased our defense spending by over 50% during the past 7 years or so. And we've invested in large projects. Look at the F-35s, for example, 88 of them for the Canadian Air Force. Look at the Arctic offshore patrol ships and the surface combatants, Michael. So the work that we are doing is something that we will continue to ensure occurs. And at every point, I will stress that the Conservative Party of Canada has voted against our measures to increase defense spending. So Canadians do have a choice here. Do they want to invest in a government that will continue to invest in the Canadian Armed Forces? And that's exactly what we will do.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's your reaction then to Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Defense Secretary? Because I'm sure you heard him today in Brussels saying that the target needs not be the 2% target, but really 5% of GDP. How possible, how doable is that for Canada in the near term?
Well, of course, we will continue to ensure that we're accelerating that timeline to get to 2% and beyond. The work continues with Minister Blair and with Minister LeBlanc to ensure that within the fiscal frame, we can make this happen as soon as possible. And of course, Canada is a very strong ally in the multilateral partnership that is NATO. We are a founding member of NATO, and we will continue to stand strongly with our allies, of course, leading the battle group in Latvia, as we have done for over 5 years. So again, our commitment to NATO is strong, and our commitment to increasing defense spending is also very strong, Michael.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, while that NATO meeting was happening, there was a cabinet meeting in Ottawa today. While you've been working on internal trade, other members of your cabinet have been speaking with American counterparts, trying to dissuade Donald Trump away from these 25% tariffs against Canada. What's the progress report there? Is there a sense that those outreaches are having any impact in the U.S. Capitol?
The effect of continued Canadian engagement in Washington is having a positive effect to ensure that we are making the case that our economies are very integrated, that any tariffs on steel and aluminum, for example, will negatively affect American businesses and Canadian businesses, American families and Canadian families, American laborers and Canadian workers. And so the integrated nature of our economy has to be continually stressed, Michael, and that's exactly what everyone who is visiting Washington or speaking with our counterparts is stressing. But make no mistake, these proposed tariffs would be completely unjustified and unacceptable, and Canada will continue to stand up strongly for Canadians in putting forward our response.
You know, I hear that, and I do wonder, is there any value whatsoever in Canada just introducing its own tariffs? Because, you know, the mere mention of tariffs from Donald Trump creates this insecurity, creates this uncertainty about Canada, and it's diverting investment away from this country. Is there any value in just introducing our own tariffs to create some level of certainty for investment in this country?
Well, I'd like to put forward a three-pronged approach that we should be following. One, we have to address the threat of greater protectionism from the United States. That's exactly what we are doing and what I just spoke to. Two, we have to reduce internal barriers to trade so that we can add up to $200 billion to the Canadian economy by doing so. And third, we have to diversify supply chains, meaning that we need to expand beyond having an 80% reliance on a trade relationship with the United States to other markets. We are the only G7 country that has a free trade agreement with every other G7 country, and we need to continue to leverage our natural resources and our raw materials in terms of trade with those other nations.
So three-pronged, none of it being our own tariffs right now against the U.S.
Well, you will recall that the Prime Minister laid out $155 billion of potential counter-tariffs should those tariffs be levied against Canada. But our response right now is to ensure that we are steady and we are firm, and should tariffs be unjustifiably levied on Canada, we will respond accordingly, as the Prime Minister has already said. But what I'm saying, Michael, is that our response needs to go beyond that. We need to reduce and eliminate internal barriers to trade, reduce the exemptions in the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, ensure that we have mutual recognition and labor mobility in Canada, as well as diversify and expand supply chains around the world.
Now, when you took over this file in terms of reducing internal trade barriers in response to Donald Trump, you talked about achieving a lot within 30 days, that many of the barriers would fall within the 30-day moratorium that the U.S. president has given Canada here. Do you still have that type of optimism?
I know that each of my provincial and territorial counterparts are working very hard to reduce their own internal barriers to trade. I met with Minister Gibson in British Columbia just 2 days ago, and she mentioned her work in this regard, and I know that that work is occurring across the country. I will take full responsibility, together with my federal colleagues, for reducing the federal exemptions in the Canadian Free Trade Agreement to a very significant degree. We will be removing exemptions on procurement, for example, on financial services, where we see duplication across the country in terms of federal and provincial barriers. And so the work is continuing, and yes, I'm optimistic.
Minister Anita, Anand, thank you for this. Appreciate the time.
Thank you very much, Michael. Take care.
You too.